close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it out. Tonight, we travel far to the Mongolian steppe, a land of endless grass, endless sky, and one extraordinary boy. His name was Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. Let us begin. The steppe in early spring smells of cold earth and new grass. There is a particular silence to it, not a complete silence, but a living one. The wind moves through the grass. Somewhere far off, a hawk cries. The sound carries for miles in the clear, thin air. This was the world Temujin was born into. His father was Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, one of dozens of competing Mongol tribes that moved with the seasons across the great grassland. Yesugei was a capable warrior and a respected man, but he was not powerful. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. His mother was Holun, a woman who had been taken from another tribe, the Merkit, on the day of her own wedding. Such was the way of the steppe. Women were taken and traded, families were broken and remade, and life was always lived at the edge of loss. Temujin grew up in a world of constant movement and constant danger. The Mongol clans were not at peace with one another. They raided each other's camps. They stole horses and women and children. They formed alliances that lasted a season, then shattered like ice in spring. To survive, a family needed not just strength, but cunning, loyalty, and the kind of deep patience that only comes from living close to the earth. The early years of Temujin's life were, by most accounts, happy enough. He had his older brother Bekta, and his younger brothers, Kasar, Karjun, and Temuge. He had his sister Temulun. He had his mother Hoylun, who was strong and practical and fierce, in the way that mothers on the steppe had to be. He learned to ride almost before he could walk. This is not an exaggeration. Mongol children were placed on horses when they were 3 or 4 years old. By 10, a Mongol boy could ride at full gallop across rough ground, standing in the stirrups, guiding the horse with his knees. Riding was as natural as breathing. He learned to shoot a bow. The Mongol composite bow was a masterpiece of engineering. Layers of wood and bone and sinew shaped into a powerful curve that took years to master. A skilled Mongol archer could fire 10 arrows in a minute, accurately, from horseback, at full speed. Temujin began learning this skill as a young child, and he would spend his entire life refining it. He learned the geography of the steppe, the rivers and the passes, the good grazing lands and the bad ones, the places where ambushes were likely and the places where a family could shelter safely through a hard winter. And then, when Temujin was around 9 years old, his world changed. His father, Yesugei, decided it was time to find a wife for his son. This was the custom. Betrothals were arranged early on the steppe to build alliances between families. Yesugei had heard of a girl from the Conqueror clan, a people known for producing beautiful daughters. Her name was Borte. Father and son rode east together across the steppe. The journey took several days. They passed through valleys where the grass was deep and green, forded shallow rivers that ran silver-cold with snowmelt, and camped beneath skies so thick with stars that the darkness seemed almost bright. When they arrived at the Conqueror encampment, Yesugei met the girl's father, Dei Sechen, and found him agreeable. The girl, Borte, was 9 years old, the same age as Temujin. She was described as having a warm and pleasant face, bright eyes, and a quiet, thoughtful manner. Temujin looked at her. She looked at him. The adults made their arrangements. It was decided that Temujin would stay with the Conqueror people for a time, in the custom of the steppe, to prove himself as a future son-in-law. Yasuge, satisfied, turned his horse around and began the long ride home. He never made it. On the journey back, Yasuge stopped to accept the hospitality of a group of Tatar tribesmen he met on the road. The Tatars and the Mongols were enemies, not always openly, but always beneath the surface. The Tatars recognized Yasuge. They offered him food and drink as custom demanded, but they had poisoned what they gave him. By the time Yasuge reached home, he was already dying. He sent a servant back to fetch Temujin, and Temujin rode hard to reach his father's side. He arrived in time for Yasuge to speak a few last words, and then his father was gone. Temujin was 9 years old. His father was dead. He was now, technically, the head of the family. But a 9-year-old boy is not yet a chief. The Borjigin clan, the men who should have followed his father, simply left. They packed their animals and their tents and moved away, abandoning the widow Holen and her young children to survive alone on the steppe. Alone, on the Mongolian steppe, with 5 children and no horses, no cattle, no men. It should have been a death sentence. It almost was. Picture the steppe in winter. The sky turns the color of old pewter. The wind comes down from the north, cutting across the grass with a cold that goes straight through felt and fur alike. The rivers freeze. The animals dig through the snow to find frozen grass. At night, the temperature drops so far that breath turns to mist in an instant, and the stars above burn with a cold, hard light. This was the world that Holen and her children faced alone. She was extraordinary. She gathered wild berries and dug up roots with her bare hands. She taught her children to fish in the icy rivers and to set small traps for rabbits and marmots. She made what food she could last as long as possible, rationing each meal with a care that was almost mathematical. And she talked to her children constantly. She told them stories of their ancestors, of the great Mongol warriors who had come before them, of the blood that ran in their veins. She told them that they were not nothing. She told them that they would survive. She told them that one day the men who had abandoned them would regret what they had done. Temujin listened. He was quiet and watchful, in the way that people become quiet and watchful when they have been forced too early into understanding how hard the world can be. He was also, even then, capable of violence. There was an incident with his older half-brother Bekta. The details are sketchy and told differently in different sources, but the broad outline is this. Bekta had been taking food, small amounts, a fish here, a bird there, from the family's meager supply, and keeping it for himself. In the harsh conditions of that winter, this was not merely selfish, it was dangerous. It was a kind of slow betrayal. Temujin discussed it with his younger brother Kasar. And then one day, the two brothers found Bekta alone on a hillside, and they shot him with arrows. Temujin was perhaps 11 or 12 years old. His mother, Hoylun, when she found out, was furious. She screamed at him. She compared him to a wolf devouring its own family. And yet, and this is something that says a great deal about Hoylun, she did not condemn him in the way that ended things. She grieved, she raged, and then she moved forward. So did Temujin. Not long after this, something worse happened. The Taichigud clan, one of the groups that had abandoned the family after Yasuge's death, decided that the growing boy was becoming a threat. They rode to the family's camp and captured Temujin, placing him in a wooden collar called a kange, a device that locked his neck and wrists so that he could not move freely, could not sleep properly, could not feed himself without help. He was passed from family to family within the Taichi-gud camp, a prisoner, a slave, a warning to anyone who thought the blood of Yasuge might be worth something. But Temujin was not someone who accepted his circumstances passively. He waited. He watched. He made small connections. A young man named Chilagun, who quietly helped him. A family named the Sorkan Shira, who showed him small kindnesses. He stored this information away. He learned the rhythms of the camp, the times when guards were less attentive, the places where the perimeter was weak. And one night, during a feast when the guards were distracted, he ran. He hid in a river, submerged up to his chin in cold water, with the wooden collar still around his neck, holding absolutely still while searchers moved past him with torches. He found the family of Sorkan Shira, who helped him, at considerable risk to themselves, by removing the collar and hiding him in a cart full of wool until the search had passed. He returned home to his family. He was perhaps 13 or 14 years old. He had already survived more than most men survive in a lifetime, and the experiences had shaped him in ways that would define everything that came after. He had learned that loyalty was rare and precious. He had learned that betrayal could come from anywhere, even from those closest to you. He had learned that survival required not just strength, but cunning and patience. He had learned that people who showed him kindness, even small kindnesses, were worth remembering and rewarding. He had also learned something else, something more dangerous. He had learned that he could endure. Whatever came at him, he could endure it. And if he could endure it, he could outlast it. The steppe had tried to break him, and it had not succeeded. That was the most important lesson of all. Time passed, as time does on the steppe, measured in seasons and migrations, rather than in years and dates. Temujin grew. He became tall for a Mongol, with broad shoulders and a strong, compact frame built for riding. His eyes, according to accounts written by those who knew him, were unusual, described as having a particular brightness, a quality of attention that made people feel he was seeing them more completely than other men did. He was not a man who looked past you. He was a man who looked at you. He found his childhood betrothed, Borte, and claimed her as his wife. This was more than simply romantic. It was political, strategic, and economic all at once. By marrying Borte, Temujin secured an alliance with the Conqueror clan, gaining not just a wife, but a family of allies. And Borte's family brought a gift, a magnificent coat made from black sable, the most valuable fur on the steppe. This coat would soon prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. But first, there was the matter of friendship. There was a young man named Jamuka, who had been Temujin's sworn friend since childhood. On the steppe, such friendships, called anda, blood brotherhood, were taken with absolute seriousness. An anda was closer than a brother. An anda was someone you would die for. Temujin and Jamuka had exchanged gifts as children and sworn their brotherhood. Now, as young men, they renewed their bond. They rode together, competed together, advised each other. Jamuka was clever and charismatic, and had already built a following of his own. In another world, in different circumstances, these two men might have risen together, but the steppe was not a world that accommodated two rising stars easily. It was a world of hierarchy and competition, where only one man could sit at the top. and where the path to the top was always built on the bones of those who had been there before. For now, though, they were brothers. And Temujin needed his brother, because the Merkits came. The Merkits were the people from whom Yesugei had taken Hoelun, Temujin's mother, all those years ago. They had never forgotten this. On the steppe, debts of honor lasted generations. And this was an old, bitter debt. One night, before dawn, a Merkit raiding party descended on the camp. Temujin and his brothers and the other men of the camp fled on horseback into the mountains. They escaped. But Borte did not. She was captured and taken away by the Merkits, given to one of their chiefs as a servant or a wife. The historical sources are deliberately vague about the specifics, but she was gone, taken, lost. For Temujin, this was unbearable. He did the only thing he could do. He went to get her back. To do that, he needed allies he did not yet have. He went first to Togrul, the Khan of the Kerit people, who had once been his father's sworn friend. He brought the black sable coat, Borte's family's gift, as a tribute, and asked for Togrul's help. Togrul, impressed by the young man's directness and moved by the memory of old loyalty, agreed. Then Temujin went to Jamuka, his blood brother. Jamuka also agreed. Together, the three forces, Togrul's Kerit warriors, Jamuka's men, and Temujin's small band, rode against the Merkit camp. The attack came at night, sudden and overwhelming. The Merkits were caught completely off guard. Their camp was destroyed, their people scattered into the dark, and Temujin found Borte. She was returned to him, unharmed, or as unharmed as a woman who had been held captive for months on the steppe could be. There was a question, never fully resolved, never fully spoken, about whether the child she was carrying when she was freed was Temujin's or her captor's. Temujin never raised this question publicly. The child, a son named Jochi, was recognized as his own. The matter was closed by the force of Temujin's will. This was another lesson. When the facts were messy and the truth was complicated, a leader chose the story that strengthened his people, and he stuck to it. After the rescue, something interesting happened. You might expect that Temujin and Jamuka, having fought so successfully together, would deepen their alliance. For a while, they did. They rode together, camped together, slept under the same blanket, as sworn brothers were supposed to do. But after about a year and a half, something shifted. The cracks appeared slowly. Small disagreements about where to camp, different approaches to how followers should be treated, subtle differences in vision about what the future should look like. And then, one morning, without any dramatic confrontation, without any formal declaration, Temujin and his followers simply separated from Jamuka's group and went their own way. It was a quiet parting. It would not stay quiet. After the separation from Jamuka, something remarkable began to happen. People started choosing Temujin. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of his story, and one of the most difficult to fully explain. He was not yet powerful. He did not yet have vast armies or great wealth. He was a young man of modest means, leading a modest band on a vast steppe full of more established and more powerful figures. And yet the word spread, carried by travelers and traders and wandering herdsmen, the information network of the steppe, that there was a young man of the Borjigin clan who was different, who rewarded loyalty with loyalty, who remembered those who had helped him, even in small ways, and found ways to repay them, who was fair in the distribution of plunder, who was fierce in battle but thoughtful in its aftermath. People came to him, not in a flood at first, a trickle, A family here, a small group of warriors there, but steadily, consistently, in a way that built on itself, the way that a snowball rolling down a hill gradually becomes an avalanche. He also did something that was genuinely radical for the steppe culture of his time. He organized his growing force not by clan, the traditional basis of Mongol society, where a man's loyalty was to his bloodline first and his leader second, but by personal loyalty to him. Your clan background did not determine your position in Temujin structure. Your skill, your reliability, your loyalty to him, these determined your rank and your rewards. This was revolutionary. It meant that talented men from obscure backgrounds could rise as high as their ability and loyalty would take them. It also meant that the old systems of clan politics, which had kept the Mongols fragmented and weak for generations, could be bypassed. He gathered his first formal group of sworn companions, men who pledged their lives to him personally, not to their clan, not to tradition, but to him. He called them his nukud, his companions. This was the seed of what would eventually become the most formidable military force in the medieval world. Around this time, a formal thing happened. The Mongol tribal elders, who had been watching his rise, decided to give him the title of Khan, not the Khan of all Mongolia. That was still far away, but a Khan, a recognized chieftain, a leader of standing. The title was Khan Temujin, but the name that would echo through history had not yet been given. That would come later. For now, he had challenges to face. Chief among them was the growing rivalry with Jamuka, his old blood brother, who had chosen a different path and was building his own power base. The two men, who had once shared a blanket and sworn brotherhood, were now on a collision course. The first major confrontation came at a place called Dalan Baljut. Jamuka had gathered a large coalition of tribes against Temujin, and the battle that followed was a serious defeat for Temujin. He was forced to retreat, to regroup, to absorb the loss, but he did not break. He regrouped. He rebuilt. He learned from the defeat, analyzed what had gone wrong, adjusted his tactics, built new alliances. This was a quality that distinguished him throughout his life. The ability to lose a battle and not lose his mind along with it. To treat a defeat as information rather than as a verdict. He also began to demonstrate something more calculated and deliberate in his approach to enemies. When he captured a group of Tatar leaders, the people who had poisoned his father years before, he decreed that all Tatar men taller than the height of a cart axle should be killed. The small ones, the children, would be spared and absorbed into his own tribe. The adult men, the warriors who might grow up to seek revenge, would not. It was ruthless, it was cold, and it worked. The Tatars ceased to exist as a separate tribe. Their people were absorbed and assimilated, and their threat was ended permanently. This was another pattern that would repeat throughout his life. He did not destroy peoples for the pleasure of destruction. He absorbed and assimilated what was useful, and he eliminated what posed a future danger. It was brutally pragmatic in a way that could look, from different angles, like either profound wisdom or profound cruelty. Perhaps it was both. By the early 1200s, the shape of history was beginning to shift. Temujin had spent years, more than a decade, fighting, allying, absorbing, and expanding. He had dealt with the Tatars. He had navigated a complex and eventually broken alliance with Togrul, the Keret Khan, who had once been his patron but had come to see the rising Mongol as too dangerous to tolerate. There had been a final war between them, and Togrul had lost. There had been the final reckoning with Jamuka. This was perhaps the most poignant chapter of the whole long struggle. Jamuka had spent years opposing Temujin, rallying coalitions against him, fighting battle after battle. He was intelligent and capable, and in many ways his equal. Perhaps in terms of raw political charisma, his superior. But Temujin had something Jamuka did not. Temujin's followers would not abandon him. Even when things went badly, even when defeat seemed possible, his core supporters stayed. Jamuka's coalition was always temporary, always fragile, held together by convenience and advantage, rather than genuine loyalty. In the end, Jamuka was betrayed by his own men, who handed him to Temujin, hoping for a reward. The reward they received was death. Temujin had no use for men who betrayed their own lord, even when the betrayal was of his enemy. Such men could not be trusted. He had them killed. Jamuka himself was given a choice. And what happened in that final meeting between the two former brothers is one of the most remarkable scenes in the entire saga. Temujin offered him clemency. He said, "In effect, we were once brothers. We can be brothers again. Your place beside me would be honored." And Jamuka refused. He said, and these may be the most quietly moving words in any account of this period, that there could only be one sun in the sky, that he and Temujin could not both exist in the same world, that if Temujin killed him, he would always carry a sorrow in his heart when he looked to the north or the south or the east or the west, but that this was how it had to be. Temujin, out of respect, granted him the death he asked for, a death without the spilling of blood, which on the steppe was considered an honorable death. He was strangled, or suffocated, or his back was broken. The accounts vary. But he was not cut down by a sword. He was given the respect of a death fit for a noble enemy. Jamuka died, and with his death, the last serious internal rival was gone. In the spring of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, the river near where Temujin had been born, an assembly of the Mongol peoples was called. Every tribe, every clan, every family that had been fighting and raiding and competing and killing each other for generations now gathered in one place. A great white banner with 9 tails was raised, and Temujin was declared Genghis Khan. The translation of that title is debated by scholars, but the most common interpretation is something like universal ruler, or ruler of all, or perhaps fierce ruler. The exact words matter less than the concept. This was a man who was claiming not just leadership of the Mongols, but something larger, something that had never existed before, something that had barely been imagined. The assembled leaders knelt. The shaman Kokochu declared that the eternal blue sky, Tengri, the supreme deity of the Mongol world, had decreed that the world was to be given to Temujin, that it was his destiny to rule not just the steppe, but everything. Genghis Khan looked out over the gathered people of Mongolia, the people he had fought for and fought against, the people who had abandoned his family and come back, the people who had followed him through defeats and victories and cold winters and long dry summers. He was perhaps in his mid-40s. He had been fighting for this moment for 30 years. And now it was only the beginning. To understand what Genghis Khan did next, you have to understand what he built before he turned outward toward the rest of the world. Because he did not simply conquer, he organized. And the organization is, in many ways, more impressive than the conquest. First, the army. He reorganized the entire Mongol military structure along decimal lines. 10 men formed the smallest unit, the arban. 10 arbans formed a zun, a unit of 100. 10 zuns formed a minkan, a unit of 1,000. These were the primary building blocks of his force. 10 minkans formed a tumen, a unit of 10,000. The great divisions of the Mongol army. Every man knew his place. Every unit had a clear chain of command. The commanders at each level were responsible for the men below them, responsible for their training, their equipment, their discipline, and their conduct. And those commanders were chosen purely on the basis of merit. This cannot be overstated. In a world where birth determined rank, where you commanded men because of your family, your clan, your bloodline, Genghis Khan appointed officers because they were good at fighting and good at leading. A man born of a slave family could rise to command a tumen of 10,000 soldiers if he proved himself capable. The results of this policy were transformative. The Mongol army became a meritocracy in a world of aristocracies, and this gave it an enormous advantage. It consistently had better commanders at every level than its opponents. Second, the intelligence system. Before any army moved, spies went ahead. Traders, travelers, ambassadors all gathered information. What were the roads like? Where were the wells? How large was the enemy force? Who were its commanders, and what were their weaknesses? Who within the enemy camp might be persuaded to cooperate? This intelligence was processed and used systematically. Genghis Khan almost never marched blindly into an engagement. He knew the ground, the enemy, and the options before the first arrow was fired. Third, the communication system. The Mongol horse relay system, the YAM, was a network of stations across the steppe, where fresh horses were always kept ready. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other, at speeds that would not be matched by any postal system in the world until the invention of the telegraph. This meant that Genghis Khan could command armies operating hundreds of miles apart, coordinating their movements with a precision that his enemies found almost supernatural. Fourth, the psychological component. This is perhaps the most subtle and most effective element of the Mongol war machine. Genghis Khan understood that an enemy who chose to surrender quickly was far more valuable than an enemy that had to be destroyed at great cost. So he established a two-track policy that was ruthlessly clear. Cities and peoples who submitted without resistance were treated with considerable leniency. Their rulers were often confirmed in their positions as vassals. Their people were left largely undisturbed. Craftsmen and scholars and artists were actually collected, treated well, and relocated to serve the empire. Trade was protected and encouraged. Life, in many respects, went on. Cities and peoples who resisted, who made the Mongol army fight and bleed and spend time and lose men, were treated with absolute, exemplary violence. When a city that had been given the chance to surrender chose to fight instead, the aftermath of its eventual fall was meant to be so catastrophic, so complete, so permanent, that every other city within hearing distance would immediately open its gates. This was not simple cruelty. It was calculated terror, used as a military tool. It saved lives in the aggregate, at the cost of enormous horror in specific instances. Whether that calculus is acceptable is a question that historians continue to debate. What is not debatable is that it worked. Fifth, and this is what made the Mongols genuinely different from almost every other conqueror in history, was their policy of religious and cultural tolerance. Genghis Khan, himself, appears to have had genuine religious curiosity. He spoke with Christian priests, Muslim scholars, Buddhist monks, and Taoist sages. He found all of them interesting. He seems to have maintained throughout his life a deep reverence for Tengri, the eternal blue sky, as the supreme divine force. But he interpreted this broadly enough to encompass the possibility that other faiths were also connected to the same sky. His empire, as it grew, contained people of every religion imaginable, and his policy was, with very few exceptions, to leave them alone. Priests and monks and religious scholars of all faiths were exempted from taxation. Religious institutions were protected. People were free to worship as they chose. In a world where religious persecution was common, where Christians killed Muslims, killed Jews, killed pagans in endless cycles of violence, the Mongol Empire was, for all its brutal reputation, a place where your faith did not mark you for death. This is the contradiction at the heart of Genghis Khan's legacy. The man who destroyed cities also built a space for religious tolerance. The man who murdered enormous numbers of people also created the conditions for an unprecedented era of cultural and commercial exchange. He was not simple. He never was. The first great target of Mongol expansion was not China proper. It was the Xixia dynasty, a Tibetan-related kingdom that controlled the corridor between Mongolia and the wealthy heartlands of northern China. The Xixia occupied territories in what is today northwestern China and were, by the standards of the steppe, a highly sophisticated civilization. They had cities and agriculture, a written language, Buddhist temples, a trained army. They were, by any reasonable assessment, more technologically advanced than the Mongols. This did not help them. What became apparent very quickly in the early campaigns against the Xixia, beginning around 1205 and intensifying in the years after, was that the Mongol military system was supremely effective against any kind of opponent, sedentary or nomadic, sophisticated or simple. The Mongols were outstanding cavalry archers, capable of sustained high-speed combat that few armies could match. But they were also adaptable in a way that steppe armies before them had rarely been. When they encountered walled cities, which could not be taken by cavalry archery alone, they learned. They recruited Chinese engineers who knew how to build siege engines. They used catapults and battering rams. They diverted rivers to flood defensive works. They settled in for sieges that lasted months when necessary. They were willing to learn whatever they needed to learn in order to win. This intellectual flexibility was as dangerous as their cavalry. The Xixia submitted after a series of campaigns, paying tribute and becoming vassals of the new Mongol Empire. Then Genghis Khan turned his attention to the real prize. The Jin dynasty, the rulers of northern China, one of the richest and most powerful states in the world. The Jin were a Jurchen people who had themselves conquered the northern Chinese heartland a few generations before. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and confident. Their capital, Zhongdu, on the site of modern Beijing, was one of the great cities of the medieval world. Its walls were massive, its army was large, its treasury was vast. They also had cavalry, a lot of it. The Jin had confronted steppe peoples before. They had walls, they had defenses. They thought they could handle the Mongols. The war with the Jin began in earnest in 1211. Genghis Khan led the Mongol armies south through the passes in the Great Wall and began a systematic campaign of devastation across northern China. The speed of the Mongol advance was shocking, even by the standards of the time. The army divided into multiple columns, moving simultaneously across enormous distances, appearing where they were least expected, destroying what they could not hold, collecting what was valuable, and keeping the Jin forces perpetually off balance and unable to concentrate. The Jin cavalry, which should have been able to match the Mongols, was repeatedly outmaneuvered. The Jin infantry, formidable in defense, could not catch the fast-moving Mongol columns to bring them to decisive battle. The Jin generals, trained in the set-piece warfare of Chinese military tradition, were constantly frustrated by an enemy who simply refused to fight on the enemy's terms. Year after year, the campaigns continued. Cities fell. The countryside was burned. The revenues of the Jin dynasty, the taxes and tribute that paid for its army and its administration, were systematically destroyed. By 1215, Zhongdu itself, the great capital, fell. The city burned for a month. When it was over, the Jin dynasty still existed, having fled south, but it was broken. It would limp on for another 2 decades, before finally being absorbed entirely. The Mongols had demonstrated something that would be demonstrated again and again in the years to come. There was no army in the world that could stop them in open battle, and there was no fortress that could hold them indefinitely. The world was beginning to understand what it had failed to understand for too long. The men from the steppe were not a raiding party. They were not a temporary inconvenience. They were a new order. In the years between roughly 1218 and 1223, Genghis Khan led his armies west into the Islamic world, and what happened there changed the course of history so dramatically that the effects are still felt today. The catalyst was the Khwarezmian Empire. The Khwarezmian Empire was at this moment one of the most powerful states in the world. It controlled a vast territory stretching from modern Iran through Central Asia into Afghanistan, including the great Silk Road cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv. Its Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, was rich, confident, and by all accounts did not take the Mongols seriously enough. Genghis Khan initially sought trade, not war. He sent a large caravan of merchants, several hundred people, with enormous quantities of luxury goods, to the Khwarezmian Empire, seeking to open the trade routes that had once connected China to the Islamic world and beyond. The governor of a border city called Otrar made a catastrophic decision. He had the merchants killed and the goods confiscated, claiming they were spies. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to demand an explanation and reparations, the Shah had the ambassadors executed. This was, from Genghis Khan's perspective, an absolutely unforgivable act. Ambassadors were protected by custom and law across the entire steppe world. Killing ambassadors was not just an insult. It was a declaration that the rules that held civilization together did not apply, that there was no possibility of negotiation, that the only language remaining was violence. Genghis Khan is said to have gone alone into the mountains for 3 days, communing with Tengri, asking for guidance. When he returned, he assembled his forces. What followed was one of the most rapid and complete military demolitions in recorded history. The Mongol army that moved west was enormous. Estimates vary, but it was certainly in the hundreds of thousands. It divided into multiple columns and approached the Khwarezmian Empire from different directions simultaneously, using the intelligence gathered over years of preparation to move with precision through territory that should have been impenetrable. Bukhara fell. Its people were driven out into the fields, and the city was plundered, then burned. Samarkand fell. Other great cities fell in succession. The descriptions of what happened to these cities are harrowing. They had been, in many cases, among the most beautiful and cultured places in the medieval world. Their libraries contained irreplaceable texts. Their craftsmen produced work of extraordinary quality. Their scholars and poets and mathematicians had made contributions to human knowledge that would take centuries to recover. And then the Mongols came. What we must understand, in the context of Genghis Khan's strategic logic, is that these cities had resisted. They had chosen to fight. The exemplary violence inflicted on them was, by his calculus, necessary to demonstrate to every other city in the region what resistance meant. And indeed, city after city, in the aftermath, opened its gates without a fight. Some scholars argue that the Mongol invasion of Central Asia was the single most destructive event in the history of that region, setting back its civilization by centuries. Others note that the Mongol Empire that followed, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, eventually restored trade and cultural exchange on a scale not seen before or since. Both of these things are true. While the main Mongol force was working westward, a portion of the army under Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Yebe and Subutai, was sent on a remarkable reconnaissance mission that would take them further west still. These two commanders rode with 30,000 men around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus, into southern Russia, defeating armies as they went. Georgian knights, Kipchak steppe warriors, a Russian force at the Kalka River, before finally turning back east. It was like a blade slicing across the face of a continent, leaving wounds that would not close for a generation. When Genghis Khan finally turned back east, the Khwarezmian Shah had died, a refugee, on a small island in the Caspian Sea, his empire destroyed. He began the slow journey home to Mongolia. He was old now, in his 50s. The years of campaign had taken their toll on his body, even as they had expanded his empire to proportions that no single man had ever controlled before. But he was not finished, not yet. There is a side of Genghis Khan that gets lost in the stories of conquest and destruction, the side that built. He created a law code. The Yasa, the Great Law, was a set of decrees and precedents that governed the Mongol Empire with remarkable breadth and sophistication. It covered military conduct, trade law, the treatment of ambassadors, the rights of women, the organization of the postal system, the protection of religious institutions, and dozens of other areas. The Yasa was not written down at first. It existed in the memories of specially trained judges, but it was enforced consistently and applied to all people within the empire, regardless of origin or status. The idea that the law applied equally to everyone, even within limits to Genghis Khan himself, was genuinely radical. He created a writing system for the Mongol language. Before him, the Mongols had no written language. He recognized that an empire of this scale could not be administered by word of mouth alone, and he commissioned the development of a script, adapted from the Uyghur alphabet, that allowed Mongol to be written down for the first time. The records, the orders, the trade documents, the diplomatic correspondence, all of this required literacy, and he made it happen. He created the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which across the vast expanse of his empire made long-distance trade and travel safer than it had been in centuries. A merchant could travel from China to Europe under Mongol protection and expect not to be robbed or taxed to the point of impossibility. The Silk Road, which had always been fragmented and dangerous, became briefly unified under a single authority. This led to an extraordinary exchange of goods and ideas. Chinese silk and porcelain, Middle Eastern spices and scholarship, European wool and glass, all moved along these routes in greater quantities than before. Chinese technology moved west. Islamic mathematics and astronomy moved east. The Black Death, tragically, also moved along these routes. But so did the beginnings of the global interconnectedness that would eventually define the modern world. He thought about succession. Not enough, and not soon enough. This would be one of his greatest failures. He had 4 sons from Borte: Yochi, whose paternity remained uncertain, Chagatai, Ogode, and Tolui. Each was capable. Each had a strong personality. He designated Ogode as his heir, but the rivalries among his sons would eventually tear the empire apart. He knew this was a risk. There is a moment, recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, the remarkable document written shortly after his death that is our primary source for the early part of his life, where he gathers his sons together and demonstrates to them with a bundle of arrows what unity means. A single arrow, snapped easily. A bundle of arrows, unbreakable. His sons nodded and agreed, and after his death, divided the empire anyway. He thought about death on the steppe. Death was a constant companion, a presence felt in the cold of winter, in the danger of every battle, in the fragility of children in hard years. The Mongols had a philosophy about death that was pragmatic in a way that could seem cold. A person who dies well, having lived fully and served their people, has nothing to mourn. The soul continues. The eternal blue sky holds all things, and yet there is evidence in the sources that in his final years he sought something more. He summoned a Taoist monk named Chu Chuji, a man of great learning and reputation, and asked him directly, "Is there an elixir of immortality?" The monk's answer was essentially no. But he told the Khan that the way to long life was discipline, moderation, and virtue. Genghis Khan is said to have been disappointed but respectful. He was a man who had conquered the world and could not conquer time. He was, in this way, profoundly human. In 1226, Genghis Khan launched his final campaign. He was in his 60s, extraordinarily old for a man who had spent his entire life in brutal military service. By the standards of his world, he had already lived far beyond what most men could expect. The campaign was against the Xia, the kingdom that had been the first target of his expansion years ago. They had been vassals of the Mongol Empire, but they had failed to provide the troops and support that vassals were expected to provide during the Great Western Campaign. For Genghis Khan, this was an unforgivable breach of the loyalty that held his entire system together. He would not let it pass. He rode west and south with his army. The campaign went well. The Xia cities fell one by one in the familiar pattern, but during a hunting expedition, something happened. He was thrown from his horse. He was injured, seriously, possibly internally. The accounts are not entirely clear on the details, but what is clear is that he was badly hurt, and that he did not recover fully. He continued the campaign. That was the kind of man he was. Injured, aging, perhaps dying, he continued to direct the war from his tent. The Xia capital fell. The Xia king was captured, and then Genghis Khan was gone. He died in the late summer of 1227. The exact cause is debated. The injury from the fall, an illness, old age catching up with him all at once. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old. The manner of his death was kept secret for a time, as was the place of his burial. The Mongol tradition was to bury their great leaders in unmarked graves, returning their bodies to the earth as quietly as they had come from it. The exact location of his tomb, if a formal tomb was ever made, has never been definitively identified. He passed into the earth as invisibly as he had come out of it, but before he died, he gave final orders. The Xixia king, who had surrendered, was to be killed. The campaign was to be completed. His empire was to pass to Ogode. These orders were carried out. Let us stay a moment longer in the world of his last years, because there is something poignant and instructive about the final phase of any great life, and his is no different. By his mid-50s, he had been fighting and riding and campaigning for 4 decades. The body accumulates damage in ways that do not always announce themselves immediately. Old wounds that seemed fully healed find ways to make themselves known in cold weather, in exhaustion, in the middle of the night when the defenses are down. The joints stiffen. The injuries of the past compound each other. He refused to slow down. There is something almost characteristic about this. The boy who had survived abandonment and captivity and defeat and cold and hunger, the man who had built an empire by refusing to accept the limits that the world tried to impose on him, was not going to accept the limits that his own aging body tried to impose on him either. He trained young men in the methods he had developed. He presided over councils and received ambassadors. He continued the long, complex administrative work of holding together an entity that stretched from the Pacific to the borders of Europe. He dictated letters that were carried to the far edges of his empire by the horse relay system, arriving with a speed that must have seemed nearly magical to those who received them. He thought about what would outlast him: the laws, the systems, the roads, the relay stations, the writing system. These were his attempt to make something that did not depend on his personal presence. An empire that could continue without him. Whether it would was another question. He knew his sons. He knew their qualities and their flaws. He had watched them compete and quarrel and show the kinds of ambition that was necessary for leadership but dangerous in men who were also brothers. The Mongol steppe has a saying, or at least a principle that runs through the history of the period, that a great man's greatness rarely passes directly to his children. The children of extraordinary people grow up in the shadow of that extraordinariness, and it shapes them in ways that are not always beneficial. They have been given what their parent had to fight for. They take for granted what the parent had to imagine from nothing. Genghis Khan's sons were not his equal, but they were formidable, and for another generation they would carry the empire further than even he had taken it. Kublai Khan, his grandson, would complete the conquest of China, build the greatest city in the world, and receive into his court the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who would bring the first detailed accounts of the Mongol Empire back to a Europe that could barely imagine what he was describing. The ripples of that original stone thrown into the water of history spread for a very long time. His body was transported back to Mongolia. According to some accounts, the soldiers escorting the body killed everyone they encountered on the road to prevent word of the Khan's death from spreading before the army could be safely stood down. Whether this is true or legend, it speaks to the anxiety that surrounded this moment. The recognition that the empire Genghis Khan had built was held together, in no small part, by his personal presence, his authority, his will. Without him, the question of what happened next was genuinely frightening. The world mourned him, or feared him, or both, depending on where you were standing. In Mongolia, the grief was genuine and deep. He had taken a broken, scattered, starving people and given them an identity, a pride, an empire, whatever he had made them do. And however brutal some of those things had been, he had transformed their world completely. He was not merely a Khan, he was the founder of a nation, in the fullest sense, in the conquered lands, in China, in Central Asia, in the ruins of the Khwarezmian Empire. The feelings were more complicated. There was relief, perhaps, mingled with the still fresh horror of what had happened, mingled with the reality that the Mongol Empire still existed, still ruled, still demanded tribute. The world did not become safe simply because Genghis Khan was dead. His sons and grandsons would go on to expand the empire further still. His grandson, Kublai Khan, would complete the conquest of China and create the Yuan dynasty. Other descendants would create the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in Russia. The Mongol Empire, at its height under his successors, would control roughly a quarter of the world's land surface, but none of them would be him. None of them had come from where he had come from that cold, abandoned camp on the steppe, with a dead father and an empty belly, and no one to count on but a fierce mother, and his own refusing to break will. None of them had made themselves from nothing. He had. Historians argue about Genghis Khan the way they argue about very few other figures in history, with a passion and a divergence of opinion that suggests they are not simply arguing about the past, but about values, about what matters, about how we should weigh suffering against achievement, destruction against creation, violence against legacy. On one side of the ledger, the accounting is grim. The death toll from the Mongol conquests is estimated, and estimates vary enormously, because medieval census data is unreliable, and the Mongols themselves did not keep careful records of casualties, at somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. Some scholars argue the number was higher. The city of Merv, once one of the great centers of Islamic civilization, was so thoroughly destroyed that its population never recovered to its pre-Mongol levels. Parts of Central Asia and Persia lost between half and three-quarters of their populations. The agricultural systems of these regions, the complex irrigation networks that made the desert bloom, were damaged in ways that took centuries to repair. A DNA study published in the early 2000s suggested that roughly 8% of men living in the region of the former Mongol Empire carry a Y chromosome marker consistent with descent from a single man living in Mongolia. Around the 12th or 13th century, the researchers concluded, tentatively, that this man was most likely Genghis Khan, or a close relative. The scale implied by that genetic signature is almost impossible to contemplate. On the other side of the ledger, there is also a great deal. He unified the Mongol peoples, who had been divided and destroying each other for generations, into a coherent nation. This nation still exists. Mongolia endures. The Mongolian language is still spoken. The memory of Genghis Khan is, for Mongolians today, a source of immense national pride. Not despite what he did, but because of the totality of what he built. He created, for a brief period, the most connected world in human history to that point. The Pax Mongolica allowed goods, people, ideas, and technologies to move across Eurasia with an ease and safety that would not be matched for centuries. This exchange accelerated the transmission of Chinese technology, gunpowder, printing, the compass, to Europe, with consequences for world history that are incalculable. He demonstrated that meritocracy worked, that an army organized around talent rather than birth could outperform larger, wealthier, better equipped forces. This lesson would be learned and relearned by military planners for centuries afterward. He demonstrated that religious tolerance was not just morally preferable, but practically effective, that a multi-religious empire could be administered without constant sectarian violence if the ruler simply chose to treat all faiths with equal respect. He left behind a family that would rule enormous portions of the world for generations, and whose descendants can be traced, royal and non-royal alike, across much of Asia and parts of Europe to this day. And he left behind a story so remarkable, so full of reversals and extremes and contradictions, that it has been told and retold for 8 centuries and shows no sign of fading. The boy abandoned on the steppe, who became the ruler of the world, the slave who built the largest empire, the man who destroyed cities and created trade routes, who killed millions and opened the world to exchange, who was simultaneously one of history's greatest monsters and one of its most consequential builders. He was, in a phrase that sounds inadequate to contain him, a human being, shaped by his circumstances in ways he could not always control, making choices, some that we can understand and some that we cannot, driven by motives that were sometimes clearly practical, sometimes deeply personal, sometimes very hard to read across 8 centuries of distance. What we can say with certainty is this: the world he was born into and the world he left behind were almost unrecognizably different from each other. He was the hinge on which that change turned. Very few people in all of human history can claim the same. No man conquers the world alone. This is a simple statement, but it bears dwelling on, because the story of Genghis Khan so easily becomes the story of one extraordinary individual that we risk forgetting the constellation of exceptional people who made the empire possible. He was the center of gravity, but gravity requires matter around it. Let us speak of some of them. Subutai, of all the great commanders Genghis Khan produced, and he produced many, Subutai stands apart. He was born into a humble family, the son of a blacksmith, and he rose to become the greatest purely military mind of the medieval world. There is no credible rival for that title. He was short and, as he aged, so heavy that he had to be carried in a cart behind his army rather than ride with it. None of this mattered in the slightest when it came to his ability to think about war. He commanded armies operating across hundreds of miles, coordinating multiple columns simultaneously with a precision that modern military historians describe as staggering. He defeated the armies of the Russian princes, the Poles, and the Hungarians in the same campaign, almost simultaneously. He fought in more than 65 major engagements over the course of his career. He conquered more territory than any other commander in history, more than Alexander the Great, more than Julius Caesar, more than Napoleon Bonaparte. And he was, to the end, Genghis Khan's man. Not a rival, not an independent operator, but a commander who understood that his genius was most fully expressed in service to a larger vision. Genghis Khan recognized talent like this and held it. He knew how to let exceptional men be exceptional while keeping them bound to his purposes. This was itself a rare gift. Then there was Jebe, the arrow, as he was known, a man who had once shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle, and then, when captured, freely admitted to the deed, and said that if Genghis Khan had the wisdom to use him, he would ride his horse into the ground in service. Genghis Khan laughed and gave him command. Jebe became one of the great cavalry commanders of the age. The man who led the western reconnaissance with Subutai, the rider of impossible distances at impossible speeds. There was Mukhali, the commander left in charge of the Chinese campaigns when Genghis Khan turned west, a man so trusted that he was given the title of Prince of State, an honor without precedent for a non-royal in Mongol culture. He spent years managing the complex, grinding work of consolidating control over the vast territories of northern China, doing it with a patience and a political sensitivity that complemented perfectly the blunt force of the original conquest. There was Borte herself, who deserves far more space than she typically receives in the story. She was not a warrior in the conventional sense, but she was his counsel, his anchor, his most trusted advisor. There are accounts of her speaking plainly to him about his plans and his people in ways that no one else dared. He listened. Their partnership lasted a lifetime and produced the children who would inherit the empire. And there were the dozens of administrators, the scholars and translators and engineers and craftsmen whom the empire absorbed and employed, the Khitan and Chinese administrators who knew how to manage settled agricultural populations, the Persian and Islamic scholars who understood how to run complex economies, the Uyghur scribes who developed the Mongol writing system and kept the records that held the empire together. An empire is not just armies, it is paperwork. It is tax collection. It is the management of water and grain and roads and courts. Genghis Khan understood this intuitively, even though he had grown up in a world that had none of these things. He found the people who knew how to do what he did not know, and he used them. This was the quality that his most martial rivals, the great fighting Khans who came before him, had not possessed. He was not just a warrior, he was an organizer of human talent on a scale the world had not seen. When you think about the size of what he built, hold this thought: he could not have built it alone. What made him great, in part, was his ability to make others great in service of a shared vision. That is not a small thing. That may be, in the end, the rarest thing. To understand Genghis Khan fully, you need to understand the world he came from, not just as background, as the living context that shaped everything about how he thought, how he fought, and what he valued. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was, in many respects, an extreme environment for human habitation. The winters were brutal, temperatures regularly dropping to -40 degrees and below, winds that could kill a man, caught unprepared in the open, snow deep enough to bury a jeer to its roofline. The summers were short and intense, with long days of blazing sun and thunderstorms that rolled across the grassland with a theatrical ferocity. And yet people had lived there for thousands of years. Not just survived, thrived, in the particular way that nomadic people thrive, which is different from the thriving of settled peoples, but no less real. The jier, the round felt tent that is the nomadic home, is a masterpiece of practical engineering. It can be assembled and disassembled in under an hour by experienced hands. It is warm enough to maintain comfortable temperatures, even in extreme cold, efficient enough to heat with a single small fire at its center. Its structure distributes weight evenly, so that it does not collapse under heavy snow. Its portability means that a family can follow the seasons, moving to summer pastures when the snow melts, and retreating to sheltered valley floors when winter descends. The horse was everything. This cannot be overstated. The relationship between the Mongolian people and their horses was, and to some extent remains, unlike anything in the sedentary world. Horses were not tools or possessions in the way that a plow or a house is a tool or a possession. They were partners. They were symbols of wealth and status. They were the means of everything: transportation, communication, military power, and in extremity, survival itself. You could drink a horse's milk. You could drink its blood. You could eat its flesh. A Mongol who had horses had life. A Mongol who had lost his horses was close to death. The Mongol horse was not the great war horses of European medieval tradition. Those large, carefully bred, armor-bearing animals that carried knights into battle. The Mongol horse was smaller, stockier, almost pony-sized by European standards. It was extraordinarily hardy, capable of surviving on steppe grass even in winter, able to travel vast distances on limited water and forage. It was not fast in a short sprint compared to some other breeds, but over a long distance, day after day, in conditions that would destroy other horses. The Mongol steppe horse was without peer. A Mongol warrior typically rode with a string of horses, between 3 and 5 remounts, allowing him to change horses frequently and cover ground at a pace that enemies on single mounts simply could not match. This was one of the structural advantages of the Mongol military that was not immediately obvious to enemies who counted horses and assumed 1 horse per rider. The food of the steppe was simple and protein-rich. Dried meat, dried in the sun and wind until it became a dense, almost imperishable food that could be carried for months. Dried milk products, hard curds, dried yogurt that similarly lasted well and traveled easily. Fresh mare's milk in summer, slightly fermented into the traditional drink called airag, which was mildly alcoholic and also mildly nutritious. When times were hard, blood drawn from a living horse through a small cut in its vein and drunk immediately. This was not a luxurious diet, but it was, for a warrior in the field, extraordinarily practical. Mongol soldiers in campaign required very little logistical support compared to the armies of China or Persia or Europe, which needed vast supply trains of grain and fodder. A Mongol column could cover distances that would have been physically impossible for a European army of the same size, simply because the soldiers and their horses were adapted to living lean. The spiritual life of the steppe was animist and shamanist. The Tengrist tradition held that the world was full of spirits, spirits of place, spirits of ancestors, spirits of natural phenomena. The shaman, the bow, was the person who could communicate with these spirits, who could mediate between the human world and the spirit world, who could heal and curse and prophesy. At the top of this spiritual hierarchy was Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and Etujen, the earth, sometimes conceptualized as a goddess. Sky and earth together framed the Mongol universe. The sky was vast and encompassing and ultimately powerful. The earth was the source of life and the receiver of the dead. Genghis Khan held these beliefs genuinely and deeply. His confidence in his own destiny, his absolute conviction that what he was doing was not just permitted but required by the divine order of things, was rooted in this worldview. The sky had chosen him. This was not metaphor. This was to him simply true. Understanding this helps explain the otherwise almost inexplicable confidence with which he operated. He was not a man who suffered serious self-doubt, not because he was incapable of reflection, but because he had a cosmological framework that told him his victories were confirmation of divine favor, and his defeats were temporary obstacles on a divinely ordained path. This kind of faith, we might call it conviction or certainty or even arrogance depending on our perspective, was itself a military asset. It communicated to his followers, and it communicated to his enemies. His followers believed they were fighting on the side of heaven. His enemies, over time, came to wonder if they were. The history of Genghis Khan's conquests is, in part, a history of cities, of great urban centers, the accumulated wealth and learning and population of centuries that stood in his path and had to decide what to do. The decision was binary: submit and live, resist and face consequences that the survivors would spend generations describing. Let us visit some of these cities, not to dwell in horror. We are telling a sleep story, and we are drifting in the direction of rest, but because these places and their fates are the places where the abstract becomes concrete, where the huge historical forces we have been discussing took specific human shape. Yanjing, the great capital of the Jin dynasty in northern China, built on the site of what is now Beijing. When the Mongols took it in 1215, they plundered it comprehensively. Gold and silk and jade and manuscripts and craftsmen were all taken north. The city burned, and yet it was not destroyed in the complete sense. Its basic structure survived. When later Mongol rulers, Genghis Khan's successors, made this region the center of their Chinese empire, they built on what remained. The city endured, was rebuilt, and eventually became the greatest city in the world. Zhongdu's fate is a reminder that destruction is not always permanent. Cities, like peoples, can survive enormous catastrophe and rebuild. Zhongzhong, perhaps not a name you know, was a smaller city in the path of the Western campaign. It submitted without resistance. The Mongol commissioners arrived, took a census of the population, assessed the city's taxable wealth, appointed local governors to collect taxes on behalf of the Khan, and left. Life, for the people of that city, continued more or less as before, except that they now paid their taxes to a Mongol rather than to their former ruler. They were perhaps not happy about this, but they were alive. Samarkand, one of the most beautiful cities in the medieval world, a center of Islamic scholarship and architecture, famous for its gardens and its libraries and its skilled craftsmen in silk and metal work. When the Mongols came, the city's defenders included both local troops and a garrison of Turkish soldiers sent by the Khwarezmian Shah to hold it. Some of the defenders surrendered immediately and threw themselves on Mongol mercy. These men were, as was customary, spared. They became part of the Mongol auxiliary forces. Those who continued to resist were killed. The city itself was not destroyed in the physical sense. It was too valuable. Its craftsmen were removed and sent east to work in Mongol territory. Its scholars and administrators were given the choice of cooperation or death. Most cooperated. The city's taxes were assessed and extracted. A new population eventually moved in. Samarkand eventually recovered and remained an important city for centuries. Merv. This is the case that historians cite most often when discussing the scale of Mongol destruction. Merv was one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, sometimes described as the largest city in the world at certain periods. Its libraries were extraordinary. Its scholars had contributed to mathematics, astronomy, medicine. Its gardens, fed by an ancient system of underground irrigation channels, made the desert bloom. Merv resisted. The siege was brief but fierce. When the city fell, what happened was one of the most catastrophic urban destructions in recorded history. The population was brought out into the surrounding fields. According to Islamic chronicles, which may exaggerate, as chronicles often do, the killing took days. Some later accounts estimate the dead at over 1 million, though most modern historians believe the actual figure was lower. What is not disputed is that the city's population was effectively destroyed, and the infrastructure that had made the city possible, the irrigation system, was severely damaged. The city never fully recovered. It faded over subsequent centuries into a provincial town, a shadow of what it had been. This is the example that haunts any assessment of Genghis Khan. One city, one decision to resist, and the consequence was the destruction of centuries of accumulated human achievement. And yet, there is another city worth considering. Karakorum. Karakorum was the city Genghis Khan's successors built, the capital of the Mongol Empire, raised on the steppe itself. Into Karakorum came craftsmen and architects from China, from Persia, from Europe. Into its great halls came merchants and diplomats and scholars from every corner of the known world. In Karakorum, you could find a Christian church, an Islamic mosque, a Buddhist temple, and a shamanist shrine, all within walking distance of each other. In Karakorum, the great exchange happened. Chinese paper-making technology moved west. Islamic algebra moved east. Central Asian art forms fused with Chinese aesthetics and produced new hybrid styles that would influence the whole subsequent history of Asian art. The first truly global trade networks, the Silk Road in its fullest and most active form, ran through and from this city. Karakorum was the creation of the same force that destroyed Merv. This is the paradox that will not resolve itself neatly, no matter how long you look at it. The destroyer and the builder were the same man, the same dynasty, the same historical force. The ash of the burned libraries was the fertilizer from which the great exchange of the Pax Mongolica grew. History rarely gives us clean judgments. It gives us complexity and the challenge of holding contradictory truths at the same time. The history of Genghis Khan is perhaps the most extreme test of that capacity in all of recorded history. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let that complexity rest softly in your mind, not as a problem to be solved, but as a reminder that human beings, even the most powerful, even the most world-altering, are never simple. They are full of contradictions, shaped by forces larger than themselves, capable of both terrible and extraordinary things. In this, Genghis Khan is not so different from the rest of us. Only the scale is different. Only the scale. Laws and the organizational systems and laws and the organizational systems and the body count. But what was the man like on a quiet evening? What made him laugh? What kept him awake at night? The sources are fragmentary and often colored by the agendas of those who wrote them. The secret history of the Mongols, our most intimate window, was written to glorify him, and reads at times more like epic poetry than like sober history. The Persian chronicles were written by people whose civilizations he had devastated, and they are not inclined toward nuance. The Chinese sources are careful and administrative rather than personal. But here and there, between the lines, certain things emerge. He had a genuine sense of humor. There are accounts of him laughing at unexpected things, often at moments of tension when others were anxious. He made jokes. He appreciated wit in others. There is a recurring quality in the accounts of his interactions with people he respected, a kind of sparring, a back and forth, a pleasure in intelligent conversation that suggests a mind that was not just strategic, but genuinely curious. He loved hunting. The great Mongol hunt, the nerj, was not just a practical activity or a military training exercise, though it was both of those things. It was also, clearly, something he took pleasure in for its own sake. The nerj involved driving game animals into an ever-contracting circle over days or weeks, with thousands of riders participating. At the center of the circle, when the animals were packed together in a terrified mass, the Khan had the honor of the first kill. The hunt was organized with the same precision as a military campaign, and for him, this was apparently part of the joy, the application of intelligence and organization to the problem of the hunt. He had deep friendships, not many, but real. The loyalty he inspired in his companions was not just professional, it was personal. Men like Subutai and Bo-Orchu and Jelme had been with him since his earliest, most vulnerable years, and the bonds formed then were never broken. He remembered favors and slights with equal precision, and he returned both in kind, years or decades later. He was superstitious in the way of his culture, but practically so, if that makes sense. He observed the taboos of his tradition carefully. He would not put his hand directly in water. Water was sacred, not to be touched directly. He would not step on a threshold. Thresholds had spiritual significance. He was careful about fire, about the direction he sat in his jur, about dozens of small observances that were as natural to him as breathing. These were not neurotic habits. They were the expression of a worldview in which the spiritual and the practical were not separated. He was capable of mercy and capable of extraordinary cruelty, sometimes in close succession. He could spare a man's life because of a small kindness offered years earlier, and order the execution of thousands who had chosen resistance. The inconsistency is only apparent. In each case, he was following a consistent internal logic. Personal loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal and resistance were punished. The scale of the punishment varied with the scale of the offense. He was, by all accounts, physically impressive, even in his age. Tall, broad, with the kind of physical presence that people notice and remember. His eyes were the thing people mentioned most, described variably as blue-green, gray, or simply unusual. They appear in enough accounts that some genuine physical distinctiveness seems likely. Whether this reflects some genetic heritage from the western steppes, or simply the way that distinctive eyes tend to be noticed and reported, we cannot say with certainty. He spoke Mongol. He probably had some functional ability in other languages. The Turkic languages of the steppe were close enough to Mongol that basic communication was possible, and he had spent enough time dealing with speakers of other tongues that he could not have been entirely ignorant. But he governed through interpreters, which was itself a kind of political choice. Using interpreters meant that all information passed through a controlled channel, and it also meant that he was never entirely at the mercy of another person's linguistic skills. He thought about legacy. The secret history records several moments when he spoke explicitly about what he wanted to be remembered for, and the things he emphasized were not primarily conquest. He spoke of justice. He spoke of loyalty. He spoke of the welfare of his people. He wanted to be remembered as a man who had taken a broken, suffering people and given them the dignity and the power that they deserved. Whether history has honored that particular wish is debatable. He is remembered for the empire, for the conquest, for the destruction. The justice and the loyalty and the welfare of the Mongol people, these are footnotes. He might have been disappointed by that, or he might have understood that this was how it would always be, that the world remembers scale and force, and that the quieter achievements dissolve into the background of the louder ones. He was, in the end, a man of his time and his place. He did what the world he was born into had taught him was necessary and possible. He did it with a brilliance and a ferocity and a consistency that no one before or since has matched. He was Temujin, the boy from the steppe. He was Genghis Khan, the ruler of the world. He was both, always, at the same time. There is one more thing worth saying about his legacy, before we let the story settle into silence. His name, in Mongolia today, Genghis Khan, is not a figure of ambivalence or historical complexity. He is the founding father, the man who made the Mongol people a nation. His face appears on currency. A great statue of him, gleaming silver in the steppe sunlight, stands outside Ulaanbaatar, on the spot where he is said to have found a golden whip, an omen of his destiny. Airports and hotels and businesses carry his name with pride. For Mongolians, he is theirs in a way that is uncomplicated by the suffering of the peoples he conquered, because those peoples are not their people. They see him the way a nation sees its founder, with pride, with identification, with the sense that his greatness is their greatness, that his achievement is their inheritance. For much of the rest of the world, the reaction is more mixed. In the lands that were devastated by the Mongol conquests, in Iran, in parts of China, in Russia, in Central Asia, the memory is darker. The Mongol invasion is the catastrophe against which subsequent history is measured. The phrase "before the Mongols" means, in these contexts, a time of relative prosperity and flourishing. After the Mongols means rebuilding, recovery, the long work of re-establishing what was lost. And yet, the scholars who study this period most carefully consistently emphasize that the picture is more complex than either simple condemnation or simple glorification allows. The same empire that devastated cities also created the conditions for the greatest expansion of intercontinental trade and cultural exchange the medieval world had ever seen. The same ruler who ordered the deaths of millions also created a legal system of unusual fairness and a policy of religious tolerance that was, by the standards of the time, genuinely progressive. We are not required to resolve this paradox tonight. We are not required to reach a verdict. We can simply hold the complexity, as we hold many complex things in life, not fully understanding, but present with it, willing to sit with the parts that do not fit together neatly. History gives us very few figures where the ledger falls entirely on one side. The honest response to a life like Genghis Khan's is not a simple judgment, but a sustained attention, a willingness to look at all of it, to hold all of it, and to let the complexity itself teach us something about the range of what human beings are capable of, both the darkness and the light. Let us slow down and look more carefully at something that deserves a closer examination. What it was actually like to face a Mongol army, not in the abstract, not as a matter of statistics and troop numbers, but as an experience, as the lived reality of the soldiers and people who found themselves in its path. because this is where the story becomes most vivid, and this is where, perhaps, we can best understand why the Mongol army succeeded against opponents who were, on paper, often considerably stronger. Imagine you are a soldier in the army of the Jin dynasty of northern China. It is the early 13th century. You have trained for years. You are part of a military institution with centuries of history behind it. You have cavalry, infantry, archers, and siege engineers. You are well equipped and well fed, and you serve one of the wealthiest states in the world. And then the Mongols come. The first thing you notice is the dust. It appears on the horizon, a long, thin cloud that stretches across the sky. You have seen dust clouds before, from cavalry patrols and moving supply trains. But this dust cloud is different in its scale. It is too broad, too extensive, and it seems to come from multiple directions at once. That fact, by itself, should alarm you. It means the force is larger than anything you expected, and it has flanked you before you have even seen a single rider. The second thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the absence of the sounds you expect. A large medieval army on the march makes an enormous amount of noise. The clatter of equipment, the creak of supply wagons, the voices of thousands of men, the bells and horns and drums of an organized military force. But the Mongols have almost no supply wagons. Their cavalry rides in dispersed formation, spread out over a wide front, living off their horses and their dried provisions. The noise of their approach is muffled and distributed in a way that makes it very hard to locate and interpret. They seem to materialize out of the landscape rather than approaching through it. Then they are there. The first engagement usually is with their light cavalry archers. These riders do not charge in a mass. They move in loose, flowing groups, riding at the edges of your formation, firing arrows from the saddle in rapid succession. Each archer is releasing perhaps 10 arrows a minute, and there are hundreds of them, potentially thousands. The arrows fall in a continuous, almost rhythmic rain. They are not necessarily trying to kill you en masse with this. They are disrupting you. They are making your horses nervous, wounding your men in the arms and legs and faces, breaking your formation, forcing you to either respond or endure. If you advance toward them, they retreat. If you halt, they close in again. If you charge with cavalry, they simply melt away before you. The steppe horse is extraordinarily good at exactly this kind of fluid disengagement, quick to accelerate and turn, and then they close in again on your flanks when your charge loses momentum. This is the famous Mongol feigned retreat. And it was not simply a trick, it was a highly drilled tactical movement, executed at speed and under pressure, requiring the kind of discipline and coordination that only comes from years of training together. The riders who performed it had to trust each other completely, to know that the man beside them would turn at the right moment, hold the right spacing, not panic under pressure. When it worked, it looked effortless. When it worked, it looked like retreat. And the temptation to pursue was almost overwhelming. In medieval military culture, when the enemy turned and ran, you chased them. That was what victory looked like. And so, again and again, commanders who knew better, who had perhaps been warned about this very tactic, gave in to the pressure from their own troops, the excitement of what looked like a rout, and they charged, and they rode into a prepared killing ground. Mongol heavy cavalry waited on the flanks and rear, positioned long before the battle began, patient and still. Archers on higher ground, a ridge, a hillside, had clear angles into the packed mass of the pursuing force. Escape routes had been blocked by columns that moved into position, while the light cavalry held attention at the front. Everything was prearranged. The feigned retreat was not a response to the situation, it was the plan. The battles were rarely long once the trap closed. They were conclusive. The force of disciplined, organized Mongol heavy cavalry delivered into the flank of an already disordered pursuing force was almost always decisive. Few armies could recover from it. The Mongol heavy cavalry was different from the light archers in every way. These were the shock troops, armored, equipped with lances and curved sabers and shields. Riding in tight, coordinated formations, they were the hammer to the light cavalry's anvil. The light cavalry created the chaos. The heavy cavalry ended it. And when the enemy was behind walls, the Mongols learned. This is the word that defines so much of their story. When they encountered a problem they could not solve with what they already knew, they found people who could solve it and learned from them. They recruited Chinese engineers who understood siege mechanics, the mathematics of trajectory, the structural requirements for machines capable of throwing large stones over high walls. They built trebuchets and ballistae, sometimes constructing them on site from locally available timber when the machines themselves were too heavy to transport across the steppe. They used fire arrows, burning materials launched over walls, the use of wind to spread conflagration once something within was burning. They used water, diverting rivers to flood defensive earthworks, cutting off water supplies to force surrender through thirst rather than assault. They were patient when patience was required, willing to settle in for a siege of weeks or months when direct assault was clearly too costly. And they used psychological pressure with extraordinary effectiveness. Before any siege, Mongol emissaries went to the city's gates with a message that was entirely consistent and entirely clear. Surrender now, and you will be treated fairly. Your people will live. Your craftsmen will work. Your scholars will study. Your merchants will trade. Life will continue, under new management, but it will continue. Resist and suffer the consequences. To add weight to this message, they sent specific, detailed, credible accounts of what had happened to cities that had resisted before. Not vague threats, specific stories. This city, in this year, resisted. Here is what happened to it. Here is the number of dead. Here is the state of the city now. Many city governments, faced with this choice and believing the Mongols meant what they said, which they did, chose to open their gates. These cities survived. Their people were enumerated, taxed, and incorporated into the empire's administrative system. Life changed, and the change was not welcomed, but life continued. Those who resisted faced a different outcome. Through all of this, the Mongol army maintained its discipline in a way that was, for the medieval world, genuinely unusual. Looting was not permitted without authorization. Everything taken was pooled and distributed according to rank and contribution, following rules established by Genghis Khan himself. Prisoners were categorized immediately and systematically. Skilled craftsmen and scholars were valuable and were treated as valuable. Fighting men who surrendered were assessed for incorporation into auxiliary forces. Those who had led resistance were dealt with according to the policies already established. The system was ruthless in its efficiency. What it was not was chaotic. It was not driven by the kind of excited bloodlust that characterizes armies whose discipline has collapsed in the heat of victory. It was methodical, organized, and operating according to rules that had been thought through in advance. This is part of what made the Mongol army so psychologically effective. An army out of control, however terrifying, can be survived through luck and cunning. You hide in the confusion, you escape in the disorder. You find the gaps where attention is elsewhere. An army of perfect, systematic efficiency leaves no gaps, no confusion, no overlooked corners. It is thorough in a way that thoroughness itself becomes a weapon. The world of the early 13th century had never seen anything like it, and it had no reliable answer for it. This is the military reality that underlies the empire. Not magic, not fate, not the inevitable triumph of some superior culture or race. The Mongols would have scoffed at such a concept, having absorbed and employed the skills of dozens of peoples in their rise. It was organization, intelligence, discipline, and the relentless willingness to learn, combined with the particular skills of the steppe, the horsemanship, the archery, the endurance, the ability to live and move and fight under conditions that would have broken most armies. These qualities produce something that the medieval world had no frame of reference for, and no reliable defense against. As you let your breathing slow, as the weight of the day dissolves gently into the mattress beneath you, carry this image with you into rest. A man who started with nothing, who survived what should have killed him, who looked at the broken and scattered people he came from and imagined something that had never existed, and then, with patience and intelligence and an absolute refusal to accept defeat as final, built it. Whatever else he was, and he was many things, some of them very dark, he was a builder. He looked at the world, and he asked what was possible, and then he made it possible. That is a human story, strange and vast and sometimes terrible, but human. And perhaps in the quiet of the night there is something worth holding on to in that. And now, as the story of Temujin, of Genghis Khan, settles around you like the dust of the steppe after a long day's ride, it is time to let it rest. Let the great empire fade gently back into the distance of history. Let the sound of hooves on grass grow quiet, and then quieter still. Let the image of that enormous, endless sky, the eternal blue sky that the Mongols believed watched over all things, grow soft and dark and peaceful above you. You are here. You are safe. You are warm. The fire crackles, the wood shifts and settles. The light dances slowly on the walls. Outside, somewhere in the world, the grass of the Mongolian steppe still moves in the wind. The Onon River still flows where Temujin was born. The mountains still stand where he hid as a young boy, where he looked out at the vast world spread below him, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of his boy's mind, began to imagine what it would mean to make it his own. We are all, in some small way, the products of what he set in motion. The world we live in, its trade routes and its cultural exchanges, its military traditions and its understanding of what empire means, carries the fingerprints of his life in ways too numerous and too subtle to fully catalogue. But that is a thought for the daytime, for wide-awake, thinking hours. Right now, there is only this: the slow pull of breath in and out, the weight of your body, completely supported, completely at rest, the warmth that comes from the inside when you let yourself truly stop. Let your thoughts drift, as thoughts do before sleep, unconnected, undemanding. A memory, a color, a half-formed image that means nothing and everything. You do not need to hold on to anything. The eternal blue sky holds all things. You are free to rest now. Breathe in and out. In and out. The fire is still burning. It will burn through the night, quiet and warm and steady, keeping the darkness soft and close. Sleep well. The sound of the fire fills the space around you completely. Not loud, but present. A warm, living sound. The small random pops and crackles of burning wood. The deeper, slower breath of the coals. The fire has its own rhythm, its own pace, its own kind of language. You do not need to understand the language of the fire. You only need to hear it. Your breathing has slowed. Your heartbeat is steady and unhurried. The thoughts that were moving through your mind are moving more slowly now, less like cars on a highway and more like boats on a still lake, drifting gently. Going nowhere in particular, not requiring any attention. The great steppe is very far away, 8 centuries away. You are here, in your own warm place, with the night outside and the quiet inside, and everything that you need is present. You are not missing anything. The story of Genghis Khan is a story of distance, distance traveled in miles, distance traveled in time, distance traveled in the space between a nobody and an everything. But tonight, all of that distance has collapsed into this moment, this breath, this soft place between being awake and being asleep. You have crossed the steppe tonight. You have seen the great sky. You have watched a boy become a man, become an empire. And now you are coming back, softly, without effort, to yourself, to your body, which is warm and at rest, to your breath, which moves in and out like the tide, like the steppe grass in the wind, like the slow turning of seasons. The fire crackles, a log shifts. The light changes softly, then settles again. You are here, you are safe, you are drifting now, not falling, but drifting, into the deep, dark, restful ocean of sleep. Let it come. You do not need to do anything. Sleep is not something you have to achieve. It is something that happens to you when you stop trying, when you let the weight of waking go, and trust the night to hold you. The eternal blue sky holds all things. You are held. Breathe in and out. Sleep well.